All right, so hello everyone. My name's Alex. For those who don't know me, I'm a first-year non-resident junior fellow here at Massey, and I'm currently in the second year of my PhD in the Center of Criminology. So though it's not my main research focus, for this talk today I'm going to be presenting on a side project that I've been involved in for about a year and a half now. And what we were basically doing is looking at the war on drugs and specifically how different racialized and marginalized groups have been disproportionately harmed by our country's prohibition of cannabis. You can change the slide. And so before I connect this to Carcass's album Heartwork, which I know you're all dying to hear, I'll just start by giving a bit more context on the project. So it started in about late 2017, involved two other people that I partnered with, who are just right there. Those people are Kwasi Owusu-Bempah, who's an assistant professor of sociology here at U of T and also a former junior fellow at Massey. And the other person who really took the lead on the whole project was Rachel Brown, who is a senior reporter at Vice News. And so what we did in the lead up to legalization of cannabis in 2018 was to try and create a conversation about Canadian cannabis prohibition and race. So at the time there was very little discussion about whether or not different racialized groups were more affected than others by Canada's decades of prohibition, but based on what we knew from data in the US and from some data reported by Jim Rankin at the Toronto Star, it was our sense that Black, Indigenous, and other racialized and marginalized communities had very likely been disproportionately harmed. So the first step was to get data, which, as it turns out in Canada, is extremely difficult to do. And this is because we're basically a country that, if anybody saw the recent series of pieces that the Globe and Mail was doing, we're a country that actively resists collecting data about race and criminal justice, and whose police departments seem to do everything they can to avoid publishing it even when they've collected it for themselves. And so Rachel Brown, using Freedom of Information requests, was able to get a number, about 3 years of arrest data from a number of major city police departments across the country that the three of us then came together and analyzed. And what we found, pretty much as we had anticipated, was that Black and Indigenous people across the country, despite having similar, if not lower rates of use on average, which we know from various surveys, were vastly overrepresented in the numbers of arrests. And so it's these disparities and their broader implications for policy that I'll discuss today in the presentation. You can change. And so Heartwork. What does it have to do with Heartwork? So I want to make three connections. I'm going to move this before I trip on my screen. Is that okay? The first connection has to do with the album itself. So Heartwork was the fourth album of the extreme metal band Carcass, and it's regularly described as a landmark moment for melodic death metal. And of course, when we're talking about the regulation of cannabis use, we're dealing with our own landmark moment, which is national legalization. Second, I want to connect it to the lyrics of Carcass's famous album, in particular the lyrics of the song Blind, Bleeding the Blind. Bleeding, okay? Now, as I understand it, this is a play on words, which is something that Carcass seems to do a lot of in the album. And in this sense, it is of course a reference to the famous saying, blind leading the blind. But replacing the word leading with bleeding, what Carcass's song really seems to get at is that allowing the blind to lead the blind is not an action without consequences, but rather an act that is fraught with some degree of damage and harm. And looking back at the history of cannabis prohibition in this country, which I'll cover a bit in this presentation, we will see very much this kind of blind bleeding the blind phenomenon. To put it bluntly, a history of policymaking that has done little more than harmed those who were forced to follow along. And finally, the word Heartwork itself, which I'm glad I did not understand as hard work. I knew it was hard work. While there are a number of ways to connect the word, I want to focus on just one, which connects to my central argument, which is that we should not be too quick to praise the seemingly compassionate hard work of the state to legalize recreational cannabis nationwide. While it is certainly a step in the right direction, legalization alone, I'll argue, does not go far enough to right the harms inflicted by the war on cannabis. You can change. So the rest of the presentation will look like this, 3 parts. I'll provide some brief historical commentary on what happened before legalization. I'll show some of the arrest data that I mentioned earlier, and then finally I'll talk about where we are now that cannabis has been legalized and what steps I think are needed going forward. I do have some Carcass lyrics peppered throughout the slides, but I'm not going to mention these, and I'll just leave it up to you to make the connection. All right, so go ahead. It's weird how they're appearing. They did not appear like this when I made the slides. So first, the history. I only really want to get 2 points across in talking about the history of cannabis prohibition. First, Canada's anti-drug laws have always been deeply rooted in questions about race and about power. And second, that if we look at the history of cannabis law in particular, what we see is not some neat, linear, rational progression from prohibition to legalization, but rather a story of poor decision-making and policy failure. It's a case of the blind leading the blind. So it begins, we go all the way back to 1908, which is the passing of Canada's first anti-drug law, the Opium Act. And it was a foundational law that defined Canada's larger anti-drug framework for decades to come and was heavily rooted in racial tensions and social anxieties over Asian immigration and settlement. Decade and a half later, 1923, we see cannabis rather mysteriously added to the list of restricted drugs alongside others like cocaine and morphine. And all of the questions of why this was added is completely unclear to even the best historians to date. Racialized narratives about marijuana smoking black Canadians likely had something to do with it. And then, although we prohibit it in 1923, our criminal justice system doesn't actually enforce the law until the 1960s, so it just kind of sits there. And with the major crackdown on pot-smoking middle-class white kids that was happening at this time, who were basically participating in the counterculture movement, this basically angered a lot of well-to-do middle-class families who, in this sudden surge of enforcement, felt like their kids were being unfairly targeted, and this is actually where we see the beginnings of a move towards legalization. 1972, we get the report from the famous Ledane Commission, which in line with public opinion at the time basically says Canada's regulation of cannabis is overly repressive and in need of serious reform. Government receives the report, and despite what seems like one of the most hopeful moments in Canadian history, basically implements none of them. 20 years pass, 1986, we take a massive step in the opposite direction. Our Prime Minister shockingly declares a war on drugs, continues to pass increasingly repressive anti-drug legislation until 1996, when we get our current law, the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. Cannabis-related arrests explode in the early 1990s, giving hundreds of thousands of Canadians criminal records for simple possession alone, a trend that sadly only comes to an end last year with legalization. We can just go to the next slide. And so if you just follow the orange line, you can basically see 1990, you have this massive surge, and this is not by race, this is just total charges for simple possession of cannabis. So you can go to slide again. So this brings us to part two, where we can now look at the arrest data that I mentioned earlier. So while the history of cannabis prohibition is certainly telling, it does not necessarily tell us who has been the most impacted. And the data that I'll show you is for simple possession only, not trafficking, and covers arrests in the city police departments from the years 2015 to 2017. And the method that we're using to measure disparities is called benchmarking. We're basically looking at the proportion of arrest next to the total makeup of the city population. And while that has a lot of limitations in itself, it's basically an accepted method when this is the best data that you have available to do this kind of work. And finally, I just want to emphasize that from surveys, we know that rates of use of cannabis are very similar across racial groups, and that by looking at simple possession only instead of trafficking, we're actually dealing in cases where officers have a great deal of discretion over whether or not to actually make the arrest, and that's a really important distinction to make. So you can go. So I'll just show you 4 cities, starting on the west coast. You basically have Vancouver here. The line basically represents the makeup of the city population. So Vancouver, 48.6% is white, 1.2% is black, 2.5% is Indigenous, and then if you look at the bars, this is the actual percentage of total arrests for that year. And so if you just take 2015, for example, 47% of arrests for simple possession were white people, under what they actually make of the city population. 17% were Indigenous, despite being only 2.5% of the city population, and 4% were black, despite being 1.2%. You can go next. Going to Edmonton, we see the same thing. It's very similar. Massive disparities between Indigenous, black, and white. Next one's Regina. This one is particularly shocking. White people are hugely underrepresented relative to what they make up of the city population. And Indigenous people, being 9.3% of Regina, are almost equal in percentage to the rest of white people. And then Ottawa, right? major overrepresentation of black people within the arrest data, underrepresentation of white people. Yeah, thanks. And so this brings us to part 3. Is legalization, in its current form, enough to repair the decades of poor and harmful decision-making that have affected the lives of Canadians across the country? Is it enough to redress the harms inflicted on those marginalized and racialized communities that were impacted even more? And I'm going to suggest that it's not. So you can go to the next slide. So to discover why I don't think it's enough, we just need to look to our neighbors to the south. So in many American states that have legalized, who will also have much better access to race-based criminal justice data, we've actually seen that racial disparities persist post-legalization, sometimes becoming worse. So just let that sink in. The racial disparities persist post-legalization and sometimes even get worse. So Colorado, for instance, right, which legalized between 2012 and 2014, there was a 51% decrease in cannabis arrests of white people post-legalization, compared to a 33% decrease for Latinx people and a 25% decrease for black people. So clearly white people in this case benefited more from legalization. And then for racialized youth in Colorado, we actually saw the opposite trend. Whereas the cannabis arrest rate for white 10 to 17-year-olds decreased by almost 10% between 2012 and 14, the rate for Latinx and black youth arrest rate actually increased by more than 20% and 50% respectively over the same period. And you can find similar stories in other states, including, for example, Washington and Alaska. And the reason why is that what we have to keep in mind is with legalization comes a whole corpus of new laws in place that regulate legal use. And so legalization does not mean, although we tend to think of it in this way, it doesn't mean an absence of law. In fact, it often means more laws than we previously had. So we have laws regulating driving while high, laws regulating underage use, laws regulating the sale of illicitly grown cannabis, laws regulating sales to underage youth, laws regulating use at work, laws regulating where you can use it, and the list goes on. And so in this new heavily regulated post-legalization landscape, we see that we basically still see police officers engaging in deeply racialized practices like racial profiling. And so for us to think that legalization alone would make the disparities go away is really silly. And so in the end, drug legalization will only amount to racial justice if the broader forces that promote injustice in Canada's law enforcement apparatus are addressed, and that is basically my main point. At the moment, our policies have simply not done this. So to conclude, I'll just end by highlighting 3 policy recommendations, the 3 of which my colleague Akwazi Wusu-Bempa has been very actively pushing for. First, we should be passing legislation to expunge people's criminal records for simple cannabis possession. This was just recently done in the state of California, and there's absolutely no reason that we can't do it here. We should be reinvesting a portion of tax revenue from the legal sales of cannabis to improve the circumstances of the communities most harmed by prohibition. And thirdly, government and private corporations should ensure that those racialized and otherwise marginalized populations most impacted by cannabis prohibition should have the opportunity to participate in the illicit cannabis industry. They shouldn't be doubly punished just because they have criminal records or histories. And so on October 17th, 2018, the state legalized cannabis in this country, showing that it was capable of adopting a less punitive and harmful approach to the regulation of drug use. But going forward, I argue that more hard work and more hard work on behalf of the state is needed. And that's it.